Today I'm here with Verity Lovelock from BBD Architects, and we're going to talk about what an architect does, how architects set up and run practices, and some of the challenges that architects face in the construction industry. Verity, could you just tell the viewers a little bit more about yourself and BBD Architects?
Yes, so thanks ever so much for having me on. I'm Verity, as you say, BBD Architects. We run a practice. We're based in Romsey in Hampshire, and we cover all aspects of residential design for private clients and for small developments as well. But we really like the residential component to it. We do a little bit of commercial, normally as attached to some kind of residential somewhere. And our practice has been running since about 2006.
Fantastic. And what about yourself, Verity? What's your background in construction?
Well, I started off as an interior designer. Always wanted to do architecture and kind of got steered in that interior direction. It was actually at uni doing interiors. It was the same foundation year for architects, and one of the tutors said, clearly you're better suited to architecture. And she moved me on. And then I realised how long the course was. And I thought, oh, I've got 7 years at university, have I? This is what we're doing. So that's where I started. And I've always felt, I don't know, a really nice relationship with the interiors aspect, or the people moving through, how people occupy a building and how they live in a home. Mm-hmm. I really identify with that. So it's something I enjoy designing residential homes, and whether that is for developers or private clients. I think when you're designing for a developer, there's, you haven't got the client dictating that brief, but you have to put yourself in that position. And for me, it's very much about designing quality homes that last the test of time as well.
Fantastic. So you mentioned 7 years, and that leads on to one of my next questions. So for viewers who may want to become an architect or get into architecture, become a chartered architect, what's the process? What do they have to go through to become a chartered architect?
Well, it's a really timely question, because actually the ARB, that's the Architects Registration Board, they're our regulatory body, because we are a registered profession. They have just had the process of having the biggest shake-up in architectural education for 50 years. So it's a momentous time in terms of architectural education. So the previous path would be an undergraduate, so you'd do your 3 or 4 year full-time degree, and then you would go out into practice and you do recorded work experience, and that is 1 year full-time. You get paid for it, and you do your professional records along with your mentor, and there you're looking at what you've learnt in that time. You're recording it all, and then you go back into university and you do another 2 year postgraduate diploma, mm-hmm. Or a master's, and then you go back into practice again. You have to have another 2 years work experience, or you have to have 2 years work experience in total before you can sit your part 3. So you go back to university again whilst you're at work to do your part 3 qualification. So all in all, it's a minimum of 7 years, but those years in between can flex. You can take more time working if you want. It's a really long time. It's very expensive, and I think they introduced an apprenticeship in 2018, which was great. You still had to do the degree. What they're talking about now is changing it completely and really focusing on competency, because what happened during architectural education is that the focus is very much on design. It's only when you get to part 3 that you actually start getting into the nitty-gritty of what you need to know as an architect, which focuses on your competencies. And that's actually arguably the most important part of being an architect. So what the ARB want to do is bring more people into the profession, so people that wouldn't necessarily be able to afford to go to university. So it's becoming more inclusive. Other routes in, not necessarily having to do that degree, and really focusing on competency rather than this, having to do 5 years design. Because, and I felt very strongly about this, at university, you're not really learning what it's like to be an architect. And to have good quality people in the profession, we need to focus on what an architect is doing every day. Communication with clients, the legal aspect, that's all really important.
That's really interesting. A couple of things I'd like to pick up there. So you mentioned ARB, just for, and this is not just for people new to the industry, there's people in the industry. Just clear up, what's the difference between the ARB and RIBA?
So the ARB, that's our regulatory body. They decide who is on the register, and they can strike you off if you're misbehaving. So we have a code of conduct with the ARB that we have to stick to, and if we're not doing our job, we will be in front of the ARB and they can take our title. They protect our title.
Okay.
Architects have a protection of title but not of function, so other people can perform the functions that an architect does. So technicians and things can still do those functions, but they're not protected. So that's the ARB. The RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, is essentially a members' club.
Right.
They represent architects, and they do work alongside the ARB with some of the qualification aspects. So they, are the PEDR records that you do as a student on your year out. They're all through the RIBA. So they work alongside us, but they are the ones that control things like the chartered practice. So you can be a chartered architect with the RIBA, and you have to be an RIBA member to do that. But the difference is you have to be ARB registered to be a qualified architect. You don't have to have anything to do with the RIBA if you don't want to.
Understood. And you've touched on my next question. So you'll see in construction when you're engaging, let's say, a designer, the term architect, technologist, or designer. Can you just distinguish the difference between the three?
Well, an architect can be a designer, but an architect can only say they're an architect if they are a registered professional. So if you do catch someone using the term architect and they are not a registered architect, they're doing so illegally. They're not allowed to do that. So that's one of the areas that we're protected. A technologist, that's a SIAT qualification that you have to go through. Architects often work very closely with technologists, and they also have their own registration and regulations that they have to stick to once they get to a certain level of qualification. Or you might have a draftsperson who is drawing. I think the difference is someone can be a designer, but when you hire an architect, you know that they have qualified in design, and that's the difference, really.
Yeah, thanks for clearing up. So thinking about the role originally, so an architect once upon a time was the project manager, did the costings, sometimes was asked to be the engineer and the contract administrator. I mean, we've seen that change. What's been the key reasons for the change of architects now probably focusing more on just the design aspect?
I think a lot of it is because of this protection of title but not of function. And in other countries, we don't see that. But it used to be an architect is the only person who could put a planning application in, that kind of thing. It's not the case anymore. And I think some architects choose to specialise and only do the design and maybe planning side of things. I think it's important for architects to keep doing that end-to-end service, because otherwise I think you lose sight of some of the aspects that I think are really important. And I know that, things like budget, for instance, if you're an architect designing for private residential clients and you only do the design and planning, you've lost a bit of how to cost things. When you go end to end, we've got tenders coming in all the time because we'll go through the technical phase, we'll go out to tender, we'll be speaking to builders all the time. We have an understanding of project costs at that moment in time. When you don't have anything to do with that, it's very hard to design to a budget because you don't have an idea of the costings at the time. So what can happen is you're designing something for a client, and then they get to they go to tender with some builders, and the prices are coming back absolutely astronomical. They can't build it. And I think it's important to be, as an architect, to always be testing your knowledge of those things. And we've got a lot of design and build projects now. So from a contract administrator point of view, we're not always required for that role. We don't really do a lot of design and build or any design and build in our practice. But I know that it's something that does raise questions about the quality, and having that impartial party being able to be present on site to answer questions and check work. And I think in some cases that is detrimental. So it is a shame that the architect isn't seen as being able to perform that end-to-end role. But I do think, the input from third-party professionals like the structural engineer and the quantity surveyor is important as well, because we legally can't do those pieces of work completely unless we're qualified to do so.
You almost stumped me there, because my next question was, why do we have concept architects and why do we have delivery architects, and what's the benefit of each? But I think you've answered that. So let's move on. So you have your own practice. So for anyone out there wondering what it takes to set up an architectural practice, how do you go about it, and what are the key things that you need to do to start up an architectural practice?
Well, when we qualify, when you do your part 3, they are really testing you, knowing that you could be going out and starting up a practice immediately, which is quite scary, really, because what they don't teach you is how to run a business. You'll have a module in, how to work your projects out so they're, you've got everything going at the right time, how to pay staff, that kind of thing, but loosely. And so I think it's really important, if you're thinking about starting a practice, to get some serious business knowledge. You need to understand about your tax. That's very important. We're not taught that at architecture school. So that's something that I think is really important. And have a really good think about your competency requirements and how you engage with clients, that kind of thing. Because the likelihood is, if you're stepping out and you're starting up a practice on your own, you're going to be dealing with a lot of private residential individuals. Understand how to work with those people. As architects, our code of conduct says that we're not allowed to work in areas where we haven't had previous experience or that are not our area of expertise. So there is an assumption that residential architecture is easy. It's not the case. It's just a very different client type. So if you've only worked in big practice, for instance, and then suddenly you're thinking, I'm going to start up on my own, and your client type becomes private residential clients, you need to think very carefully about how competent you are to be able to manage those particular projects, because then you are the port of call from start to finish. You're not relying on other people in the practice, to be able to take over bits and pieces. You are a one-stop shop. So that's very important to consider. And the type of project you take on. So it's important to understand that you need a variety of projects. I know a lot of practices that have started up and their downfall has been taking on one massive project. And if something happens to that project, you're done. Yeah. So understand what you have the capability to take on and what your area of expertise is.
And that's ultimately what a professional is, isn't it? Yeah. Understanding your capabilities, knowledge and experience. What about the less sexy stuff, so the commerciality stuff? And so what type of insurances do you need in place and structure to run an architectural practice?
Insurance wise, you need to make sure you're covered for your indemnity insurance, your personal indemnity. And so that's if you've designed something and you've got a client coming back and they're not happy about something, or something has gone wrong in the building and it's come down to what you have designed, you need that to be able to back you up. That's really, really important that we have that. And that's one of the main things that we're taught in our part 3, is make sure you have that insurance. And I think there are some people that might do ad hoc jobs. Maybe they work for a bigger practice and they do some ad hoc residential stuff. Are you covered? Have you got the insurance? If something happened, most of the time the answer is no. And your practice, your big practice that you'll work for, although you're covered with them, you're not covered as an individual doing that work. And that's something I have had conversations with people about in the past. So make sure you've got those insurances in place, and make sure it's the appropriate insurance for the work that you're doing. Particularly since Grenfell, there's, insurance is tricky because they don't want to cover for any type of cladding. So although we do quite a lot of cladding just on residential buildings, and we don't do anything high rise, insurance companies went a bit nuts about what you're covered for, what you are and aren't covered for, and there was a point where you couldn't get any kind of cover if you put any kind of cladding on a building, which was ridiculous. So they've calmed down a little bit now, but you need to be disclosing what type of work you're doing, and that's why it's important when you're running a practice that you don't take on a project that is far beyond what your liability would be.
Yeah, I think you made some really good points there. I mean, professional indemnity insurance is about negligence, isn't it? There's lots of sub clauses and exclusions.
Yeah.
You need to be really aware of those.
Yeah,
absolutely. And making sure that your liability is in proportion also with your fee and the size of the project. It's very easy for clients to say they want 5 million, you're doing £500,000 worth of work.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a commercial assessment there as well, I guess.
Yeah.
So continuing on from that then, so how do architects set their fees for clients?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think it depends what area of architecture you work in. So I cannot speak for all. We don't do large scale commercial projects. We do residential homes and work for smaller developments. So we might do 10 to 15 units in terms of flats and things like that. For the residential clients, it's a bit of a mix. So the RIBA used to give you indicative fee scales. They don't do that anymore. But it was an idea of, the proportion of your construction budget that you should be putting aside to pay an architect, that kind of thing. But with the complexities of projects now in terms of sustainability criteria, or even if you've got something like a listed building, you have to take that into account. So the value that you're spending, you couldn't say, if you've got £100,000, for instance, to spend on a project, you couldn't say, it's 10% of that, because actually it depends on the complexity of what you're looking to do. But we work it out a little bit using the old RIBA fee scales as a kind of rough percentage of the build cost, but also taking into consideration the complexity. And I think for architects, it's very much about the value that they're offering, because for our private clients, we've developed a kind of system really that takes them through 3 stages of design, and we know we'll always show them something that looks like a hand-drawn drawing, because people will connect a bit more with that. We always show them a 3D and give them some views of the building, and I think that's where our value lies. And I think it's very important when you've got the fees from your architects and you're looking at those quotes together, that you're understanding the value, because you could have, a sole practitioner that gives you a fee for something, and what they're doing is only up to planning, and it's just CAD drawings. So you've not got 3Ds. You might not have any furniture in those. They might look quite cold. You might not have the ability to change anything if you want to. So look at what the offering is in that quote compared with the others, and then you'll understand the value a bit more. But we work it out on how many hours it's going to take us, how complicated the build is, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so it sounds like you use percentages sometimes where appropriate. You'll price it based on the time for the specifics of each project. And sometimes I guess you can use the percentages then to benchmark whether you're competitive at times as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And also things like how much do you want the project? Is this project going to look fantastic for our portfolio? Could we be a bit competitive in order to be able to use this project to progress us down the line a little bit? So I think when you're running a practice, there are considerations as well. But I think what you've touched on is really important, because as an industry, there is a history of undercutting, wanting to win work, so doing a lot for free and undercutting other people to be able to win it. And actually, that's not always sustainable. Paying your staff appropriately is really important. And in the architecture world, there is a terrible culture of unpaid overtime. And if you're not eating breakfast at your desk and eating dinner at your desk, you're not doing it well enough. And that, I don't think that's okay. It's not the way we work. I don't think it's the way the industry should work. So it's really important to fee appropriately and pay your staff appropriately, rather than undercutting to win the work and having to rush things through and stressing your staff out. So it's what someone's prepared to pay for it. You don't need to be silly about your fee, but it's understanding that there is value to what you're doing and not being worried about your fee, not solely because people will pay it if they see the value. And that's what's important to remember. You don't need to be undercutting because it's not all about the price. It's not all about that number.
Very good point, well made there. So for anyone looking to appoint an architect or looking to appoint your services, what's the sort of process and what type of things should a potential client be asking an architect?
That's a really good question. I've just written a blog about this actually, because I think
you should know the answer then.
Yeah. Yeah. You well, hopefully I do. Yeah. It's very much about what I was talking about just now, to be honest. It's the value. What do you need? Do you need someone who is going to take your project end to end? How much time have you got to invest in this project? If you're looking at an architect that only goes to planning, what are you going to do past that point? Have you got someone else lined up? How much involvement do you want? How do you want to be finding your structural engineers, or would you rather someone was doing that for you? So very much about the value of the architect that you're going to and what they're offering. Are they offering an end-to-end service? Are they just offering to planning? So much about personality. You have to be able to get on with your architect. You'll be working with them for a big chunk of time. It's really important to be very honest with them about your budget, about your needs as a family. One of the things I really love about what I do is getting to know my clients and understand how they live. That's really important to me. And this is, when you're working with people's homes, that's a really personal space, isn't it? That's the place where people go back to relax, to enjoy time with their family. That's where you'll be at your most vulnerable. So that space is hugely important. And choosing an architect that understands that, I think, will get you a long way, because it's not just about drawings, which I think can be a bit of a misconception at times.
So you seem really, really passionate about what you do. What's your proudest moment in architecture?
Oh, there are lots. I think it's the little everyday things, to be honest. I don't have one particular thing, but when I'm working with a client and you're showing them the design and their face lights up and there's something that really clicks with them, or it's, oh, I hadn't even thought of that, or, that's really lovely, I can see myself there, and they're really happy. Both Lawrence and I feel the absolute joy in those moments, because that's what's important, that they've engaged us to do something that they don't know anything about. They can't do it themselves, and they have a vision, but they may not be able to articulate it or know exactly what that is. So when you show them something and you've done it, their brief is a list of words and feelings and thoughts, and then you've shown them an actual space that depicts all of those things, that's really exciting. So I get a massive buzz out of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you mentioned Lawrence, for those watching, that's your business partner, right?
Yes, yeah, he's my partner and business partner, yes. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So we've talked about running the practice, how you structure your fees, things around insurances, how to appoint an architect. Now, that's setting up a practice. What about sustaining a practice and succession planning? Because one of the things we've talked about previously, and I've encountered when I speak to other architects in practices, is architects by nature are, say, artistic or what have you. They're not necessarily got their head in running a business. So does that cause issues, or are there challenges there in terms of sustaining and succeeding a business after yourself and Lawrence?
Yeah, I think this is something that architects struggle with, because each architect will have their own very unique way of thinking and designing. There's a lot of neurodiversity, I think, within architects, dyslexia and ADHD, autism, that kind of thing. We've all got very individual brains, and the way we work is very individual. And when you've set up a practice and you're running it, how to pass that on for someone else to do it the way you do it is hard, really, really hard. And it's something you can't articulate. You can't write it down. You can't say design something like this, because it will just come from the way your brain works. And you might be able to see things that other people can't. That's one aspect of it that I think is quite difficult. I think a lot of architects get into practice running accidentally. So you'll start as a sole practitioner and then it just sort of becomes bigger and bigger. And one of the challenges that we had, we engaged a business coach a few years ago who went all the way through our processes. Is you don't always think at the beginning when you start a practice of where you're going to end up. So having a clear vision with those goals attached to it as you move through really helps, because to be able to start off the practice as if you've got 10 people, say, thinking about the processes, how you write them down, how you delegate and outsource so that everything doesn't just end up in your head and you've suddenly got to try and put it all down on paper. That, you know, massive piece of advice, because we did have a point where we thought, hang on, the practice is bigger than the systems and processes that we've got in place, and then you've got to go back and do it. That's not the way to do it. So thinking about that planning from the beginning is really important. And I think architects have a real issue with being able to let go, probably due to that first point that I mentioned of having a very specific way of designing and thinking. Being able to let go of some of that responsibility and pass it on is sometimes very difficult.
Okay, so Verity, we've talked about obviously running a practice, sustaining a practice. Let's talk about some more practical things. So what are the challenges architects face operating in the construction industry?
I do think there's a number of things. I think one of the challenges is the structure that you have to operate in. I know that I've discussed it with people in the past, and yourself, planning is a really interesting one and something that we have to navigate on a daily basis. And I don't think the planning system has caught up necessarily with the needs of people and how things should be designed, and they don't have that design expertise in-house when it comes to local authority. So one of the challenges we face often is we'll submit something and case officers don't always understand how to read drawings, some of the things we have to explain, and that's frustrating as architects because we can see what we're doing is creating benefit. You know, we're not out there to cause demonstrable harm to the local environment.
Yeah.
That's not what we're doing. So planning is supposed to be presumption in favour, and it rarely works that way. I don't know if anyone has had experience of navigating that planning maze, but very rarely do you feel that any decision is being made in favour of, and then coming up with, reasons why it could be causing harm. It's always, okay, no, this is bad. Let's see if we can let it, not even let it through. Let's see if we can stop this from happening. And I think that's a challenge. We have a really high success rate in terms of planning, but we shouldn't have to work so hard. And that's one of the frustrations I think many architects face.
Yeah, I think developers would also have a similar view to that, as well as how long sometimes it takes things to go through planning, regardless of some of the guidelines of how long things should take.
Yeah.
But as a sort of fellow professional in the construction industry, there's times when I'm travelling around and I look at buildings that are fairly new, they're discoloured, they look dilapidated, they look terrible in terms of construction, design, and even architecture, dare I say it. How do we balance getting through planning so we have a nice streamlined process, but without losing good design, good quality construction in line with sensible budgets, so we just don't have poor buildings and low quality? Because there's got to be a balance, right? There
absolutely has to be a balance. I'm very biased, and I think architects should be involved. A lot of the time architects aren't involved in those bigger projects, and I think the local authority will really water down schemes sometimes and insist on materials that you wouldn't necessarily choose for their longevity. That, like, you see some of the rendered buildings that are just look really grubby and they're streaked, aren't they?
Yeah.
And that's because the local authority are insisting on an arbitrary change of materials, when it's not actually maybe necessary, that kind of thing. And I think there's no consideration paid to the vernacular of local architecture, or if somewhere has a particular stone, maybe that should be taken in as part of the scheme. No, it's always just choose some bricks and change them up, have this type of brick and then different type of brick to make sure it's all different. And the local authority will have that kind of input. And actually, as a design aesthetic, that's not necessarily the way it should be. In terms of costing those, good quality architecture doesn't have to cost a lot. That, and I think that's a bit of a misconception. It's not about the cost, it's about the quality of the space that you're designing. And I do think that some of the things that you have to do to work with the local authority are counterintuitive. They're working against good quality. What they think is good quality and what an architect might think is good quality are two different things.
So sticking on the theme of quality, so over the last 5+ years, a big hot topic for many of the institutions, CIOB, one of them springs to mind, are focusing on the quality within the construction industry of the end product, but also of design. How can architects play their part in ensuring good quality buildings?
The RIBA have a 2030 climate challenge, and that's something that all architects are encouraged to take part in. And I think if architects had their way, they're working towards that all the time. I think the challenge is working with your client, whether that's a developer or private client, to be able to still maintain the quality of something and be able to meet the sustainability criteria within a budget. And I think the budgetary constraints are probably the hardest thing to meet. In terms of good quality architecture, lifetime homes aren't lifetime homes. I could walk into a lifetime home and that doesn't feel like someone could actually live in it forever. So what do we mean by lifetime homes? That's one thing I would think. You could have a socket at the bottom of the stairs for a future stair lift. Does that actually mean that someone could live in that space for their life? Probably not. So I think a review of how those buildings perform over time is really important. And understanding from a developer's point of view what they need in terms of their return for them to maintain quality. Often they're the big developments, for instance, have enormous 106 payments that they have to make to the local authority. If that was less, would they be able to put less homes of a better quality on the site? I know the local authority like the big 106 payments, obviously, so that's a challenge. But the focus should always be on not just meeting those minimum standards of room sizes, but the usability of that space. And that's not always about how much it costs. It's about a review of individual units and maybe having more professionals within local government, more architects within local government who can review those plans. I think that's part of it. We don't do these large scale. My practice does not do large scale developments, but I know how I work on an individual's home and how I work for small developers. And if we could squeeze 5 units into something, but I know ethically they are not good places to live, I can't present that, and that's very important to me. So I think understanding that line between what you can do ethically and what you can do for a developer is important.
Yeah, I think you've answered that really well, and it says a lot about yourself and your practice. So a good friend of mine, existing work colleague, Phil McCabe, has posed a question on LinkedIn. I can't remember it, so I'm going to read it.
Yeah, that's okay.
So Phil says, the designs are rarely constructed to client budgets. The problem becomes bigger as the dream vision has already been sold to the client by the architect, leaving the project manager, cost consultant, and contractor with the problem.
Yeah.
Increases in costs are associated with complex finishes and details, buildability, and product material specifications, and at times the inflexibility of the architect to move. How can the architect work differently to achieve a more accurate design to budget or within the cost plan?
This is an excellent question. I'm really excited to answer it.
Phil would be pleased you said that.
I can't speak for all architects because I know there are a lot of architects that do this really badly. And I think it kind of goes back to the question about setting up a practice. You need to understand what you need to know. You need to be able to answer these questions for clients and work to this kind of level before you go into it. Sometimes, like I said earlier, architects will only work to planning. And so when they're designing something, they have no real concept of how much something costs. And we've actually recently reviewed some plans for a lady that came to us who said, my architect's designed this, it's really lovely, but I went to a builder and it's actually going to cost me 3 times as much, and I don't have the budget for this. And you kind of think to yourself, I think to myself, how can it get to that point? How has that happened? It's something that's really important to us, because if we design something for a client and they can't build it, that's not okay. We want to see them in their home with their smiling face, enjoying their space. We don't want to cause them any additional stress. So the first thing that is really important to understand when you're working with a client is, what is their budget? And if they just give you a number, don't just take that number and say, well, that's their construction budget, I'm using it because it suits you. Challenge it a bit. So I'll use this as an example. A client comes to me and they say they've got £100,000. Now, remember, this is not the way we work. I'm going to tell you how not to do it now. So they say, I've got £100,000. And we say, okay, great. And we go away and we design their building, and it's £100,000. Their extension, it's £100,000. Construction value, we think that we've got that in the ballpark. And then actually it turns out that there's VAT on top of that. So it's 120,000 now. And there's architect's fees in there. So actually it's 130,000 now. And there's other fees. There's your ecologist fees. There's your structural engineer's fees. Just as an example, approved inspector, you've got statutory planning stuff, a contingency. Maybe now you're at 150,000 and you're 50% over their original budget. When they said 100,000 to you, were they talking about 100,000 construction budget, or were they saying, I've got 100,000 in my pot to spend? So that's the first thing that you have to understand. And one of the exercises that we go through with a client at consultation stage, we will understand their budget. We'll understand if it includes VAT. Have they got a contingency? Are they including their fees in that? And we'll work backwards. And if actually what we get to is 50,000 and they don't have enough to do what they want to do, we're just honest with them. And we say to them, at the moment, when you work backwards with that pot of cash, you've got 50,000 left. Is that enough? This would give you this kind of area of extension. Would that be enough for you? And they have to be informed to be able to make that decision. They have to be able to understand that. It's not ethical for me as an architect to say, oh, great, £100,000 construction budget. Yes, I can definitely do this for you because I want the work. That's not okay. So that's the first thing that you have to get to. And it means if I don't get the work at that point, that's fine. They have been able to make an informed decision, maybe go away and save up or change their brief, but they've got all of the information. The other thing is having an understanding of those construction costs. So we have tenders moving through all of the time. And if you're an architect that doesn't, then you need to get clued up on how much things are right now, and you need to be able to understand how to price things up. So during our design phase, when we're giving people different options, we might have, option 1, and we will put costings associated with it. It's hard with a refurb when it's a bit of a guesstimate, and we always say, look, these are estimated costs and they might be inflated, but we'd rather give people a worst case scenario. But when we're detailing those costs, we present them with X VAT and then show them with VAT added so they can see how much that VAT is, because there's no point just presenting them without VAT and then suddenly chucking 20% on at the end. We might give them a range for different items. And it's really important that as we're designing, we might say, look, option 1 fulfills your entire brief, everything you said that you wanted, but we think this is where the costing is, and it might be over and above. They might say, oh no, we can't do that. Or they might say, okay, well, that's everything we want, and actually we could find that extra money. But it's important for us that we give them a range. So at one point we might give them 4 different options, and all of those will have a cost associated with them. And being able to understand, have a general idea of those costings is really important, and your client's appetite. So they might say, we don't really have a budget, we just want to know how much it costs. Being able to give a ballpark is really important. So from the offset, we will present them with construction figures, because they might say, oh, actually, we don't have a budget, but that's way too much. So you need to have an understanding of where their limit is. Street value of a home as well. You need to be saying that if this is going over and above the street value, if you had to move tomorrow, would you get it back out? Think about that sensibly. It was awful. I think it was 2 years ago now, 18 months, 2 years ago, where construction costs really spiked. It was whenever everything went down and there was a boat stuck in the Suez Canal, and it was a horrible mix. And we'd always used a rough square metre rate of about 2,000 a square metre when you're building in ex-VAT, when you're building in builder profit and things as well. And suddenly we were working at 2,600, 2,700, and that was quite different. And we've settled a little bit now, so we kind of know where that is. But it's important to understand a rough cost of how much it will cost to take a wall out, put a beam in, fit a bathroom, that kind of thing. It's one of the biggest things that I think architects get wrong in private practice in particular. And if a client has a really tight budget, we engage with an estimator or QS and say to them, pre-planning, why don't we get this costed on these planning drawings and then some really heavy specifications that someone could give a closer estimate for us, so you can make an informed decision of whether this is what you're taking to planning. And some clients want to take that up and some clients don't. But it's important that those discussions are being had all the way through.
I think you've answered Phil's question really well there. And I think what you've also highlighted, in addition to design and controlling and managing budgets, the importance of the briefing stage with the client, to make sure before you do anything, everyone fully understands the project and the brief. Just to kind of wrap up now, so that was my questions. Verity, is there anything that I haven't asked you that's important for anybody looking at architecture, understanding architecture, I haven't asked you?
I don't know. There's nothing springing to mind. I've really enjoyed the questions today, and I think you've covered some really important topics, and there's things that are quite close to my heart as well. The culture in architecture and working with clients brief, costings, all of those things I think are really important and things I talk about a lot. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to answer those.
Well, on that basis, Verity, thank you for your time. Thank you for answering the questions. Really insightful. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks ever so much for having me on.
Thank you. So thank you for watching our video. I really hope you found value in what we've been discussing today. If you have any questions, we really look forward to hearing from you.